Hi, welcome to the DRH show where I have wide-ranging conversations with fascinating people. We talk about all things psychology, mental health, and wellness. Today, I'm joined by a writer and an art therapist, Sandie Jessamine. Thanks for joining me.
Hi, Dennis. How are you?
I'm very good, and thanks for joining me. I know there's a bit of a time difference, but thank you for spending a chunk of your time before you go to bed, Sandy. Um, you have a bit of an interesting trajectory, and I understand you also have been diagnosed with BPD and complex PTSD. So, Sandy, if you could just give us a snapshot of what led to these diagnoses.
Okay. In complex PTSD, I was diagnosed with in my early 50s, which is really quite late. I was working in a correctional centre and felt quite burnt out, and also had a little son at the time with autism. Oh, this is in my 40s, sorry. So in my 40s, I went to see a therapist because I was in a stressful job working in for corrective service. My little son had been diagnosed with autism, and the therapist, he looked at work strategies, but he began to notice that in therapy sessions I was dissociating, like I would be me, Sandy, and then I would be acting and talking differently. And he recognized that I had complex post-traumatic stress disorder. He was a doctor who'd become a medical doctor who'd become a psychotherapist. So it wasn't a so-called psychiatric diagnosis, but he got it absolutely right. He started to look at my background, and I realized I had so much trauma in my life that I'd learned to deal with by dissociating. And when the trauma was triggered, I would be in a really bad way. And I was under a lot of pressure at the time. But long story short, I used yoga and a lot of swimming and writing to deal with it. So fast forward about 10 years to 2014. I was working as a teacher in the prison system in a men's protection prison, where I was working with the police in custody who'd been charged with crimes, with child sex offenders and Crown witnesses. And it was quite a laid-back prison. But while I was there, my daughter relapsed on drugs. She had an ice dependency. Around the same time, my father was dying of cancer. And my life imploded in a way. And at the same time, I had a conflict with a boss, and I became very isolated in the prison. And I think I'd been treading water. I'd been in that environment for about 14 years, and I began to feel the most intense emotional pain. I was going to work and I was teaching creative writing, but I wasn't functioning. And I actually got involved, not sexually involved, but I actually got involved with an inmate, a former police officer, and he was in there for child pornography. And I was isolated from colleagues, and he was our education clerk, and he sort of stepped in as a support person, which was totally unethical. But the problem is, the minute he saw me vulnerable, it was like a bit of a shadow relationship where a lot of his masks slipped off, and I was suddenly hearing about horrific things like child pornography, which wasn't part of my role. And I had this breakdown where I would be in emotional pain. I would drive to work and I'd have no recollection of the day. There were often no staff about, and the inmates began to notice that I wasn't me, Sandy. Sometimes I was Sammy, which is another part of me, and Sammy is a 13-year-old, which sometimes I was like a little child. And one day an inmate came in and said, "Look, we're worried we're going to find you curled in the fetal position. And to me, none of it was real. It wasn't happening. I kept thinking, Sandie, go to work, teach a class in the morning, a class in the afternoon. And I only had a few students because it was a prison, and you'll get through this. And what happened is I didn't get through it. I became more and more disorientated, and I was experiencing what I now know is depersonalization. Even though I'd worked as a counsellor in the past, I wasn't that familiar with these terms, where my limbs were floating around me and I wasn't in my body, and I was a stranger to myself, and I was hearing voices in my head. And the prison didn't feel like a prison. I was in a prison in an isolated education block with the inmates who were watching me have this breakdown. And it was like I was in some sort of dreamscape. And of course, if a teacher starts to, all the internal barriers and boundaries can't come down, what happened is with this inmate, he began to dissociate too. And I was seeing all different parts of him, and I was really trapped in this situation and had lost support. So anyway, obviously it got to a point where staff realised, and I was marched out of this prison. This is a Sydney prison, put in another prison, ordered to sit in a back room for 2 months, probably until I was better. I wasn't allowed to teach, and I was told, nothing happens, Sandie. This will all go away, just it's being swept under the rug. Nothing happened, you'll be okay. While I had this breakdown, my therapist, who had worked with me with complex PTSD, was away overseas, and he came back just at the point, and I said to him, I don't know what's happening. I'm in some sort of very strange dream state. And I said, I'm okay at work because I'm sitting in a back office reading novels. And what happened is I started to say, I've got to come back to my body. I've got to use yoga. I have to ground myself. I was transferred out of the protection prison, marched out with an officer manager on each side, plonked in the main jail, and told to sit in a back room for 2 months. And I was just happy I wasn't losing my job. I knew I'd had some sort of breakdown, but I couldn't grasp it. It was like there were compartments in my brain, and one part was impersonating normal Sandie, and I was losing memory. I couldn't access what had actually happened with the inmate, except I'd scribbled and I had a lot of writing. So once my therapist who'd been overseas, once he came back, he worked on me with coming back in my body. I was still in a prison. I had to be grounded. I was a teacher. I had to be responsible, even though I was reading novels. And so what happened, I used yoga and writing and swimming to ground myself and to feel like, I was made of flesh again. And then and I began teaching. The minute I could communicate with other staff who thought I was just depressed because of the way I'd been moved, I began teaching creative writing again. Well, about a few months later, my father actually died. And while I'd had this mental breakdown, I'd been estranged from my family. I was an adopted child, and I'd been estranged from my family. Yeah, I loved my father, and I wanted to go home in the months before he died. And, I wanted to reconnect with him. I had no idea how I was going to do it. I had a lifetime of internal barriers, and I knew that if I drove to the country town where they lived, my body would arrive, but I would be holed up in some corner of myself. So somehow during that breakdown, I broke through all of these layers of myself. It was like I was going through who I'd been as a teenager and a child, and I was almost falling back in time. And somehow in the middle of it, I had managed to drive there, and I'd managed to authentically, genuinely be with him and be an adult with this dying old man, not a wounded child. So that had happened in the whole time I was having the mental breakdown. I was in lots of realities. So after he died, I was there when he died. I do a bit of Reiki, and I did a Reiki healing on him while he was in a coma, and he opened his eyes for a second, which was quite amazing. But after he died, I was at work and I was just filled with grief. Nothing had changed in my life. My daughter, drug addiction was getting worse. I was in this prison and I was apparently acting normal again. And this is a bit waffly and strange, but one day it was almost like I thought, I don't know who I am anymore. And one strange day, an officer from the protection prison rang me, and he put one of the inmates on who wanted to know where some music or a story was. He'd been one of my students. And I heard hearing a voice from the other jail I worked in triggered something. I was sitting in the teacher's staff room. After the call, I walked into the kitchen, the education kitchen, thought I'm going to make a cup of coffee. I'm really disoriented. And I put out my hand to grab this mug off just an ordinary coffee mug off a coffee rack. And the mug I'd been using was a white mug, and I actually have it at home here, and it had ice cream cones on. Mm-hmm. And just after I'd been transferred to this prison, a week or two, this mug had appeared in the education kitchen. Mm-hmm. And the teachers had gone, "Is this yours, Sandie?" And I've never seen it before. And it was totally honest, I'd never seen it before. We're passing this mug around going, well, how does a mug arrive in a prison kitchen where the teachers work? And, my boss was going, well, maybe the officers are sneaking in at night, the ones on night shift and stealing our biscuits, and they've left this mug.
Is that just one of the triggers, though, Sandie, or are there any other triggers for you to experience dissociation and sort of flashback?
Or the mug wasn't the trigger, the mug was the breakthrough. Mm-hmm. At that time, I knew I dissociated, but I didn't, it was just a meaningless word. So when I reached out for this mug, I'd been drinking from it for months, and it was the same mug I'd never seen when it appeared in our kitchen. And as I reached out, I remembered being in Woolworths and actually buying this mug. And it was like I was in two places at once. And I went, but that makes no sense. It wasn't the type of memory where you've forgotten something that you've done. It was a type of memory where I'd never experienced buying the mug, but now I was seeing myself buy it. And it was like a child's mug, a little girl's mug. And I knew I'd broken through, and suddenly as I held the mug, I saw a lot of things that happened in this protection prison. And like a criminal, which I wasn't, I wrapped the mug up in paper towel. I was acting very odd, snuck it out of the prison, even though I realised it was mine, and I took it to my therapist. And he said, "Why have you got this mug?" And I said, because I told him how it had just appeared and I'd never seen it, and I remembered buying it. And he told me that I'd broken through one of my amnesic dissociative barriers. Because often he worked with different parts of me. And like I said, I was a functional teacher. I'd been a counsellor. And we realised that somehow I'd reached into a part of my brain where a different me had bought this mug, a child state. And once that happened, I began to remember what had happened in this prison. And it was very odd things, you know, like I totally breached my professional boundaries, like hugging and rocking with this inmate and singing songs, but it was like a little child reaching out, you know, save me, I'm in trouble. So lots of memories came back, and I ended up telling my boss, I thought, this is all being covered up. I have to deal with it. I cannot deal with this in therapy and authentically if I can't say what happened at work. So I wound up writing a report and said, look, last year when you marched me out, I know what happened, and these memories are happening. And I sent to a psychiatrist, of course, and the psychiatrist went through my history, as they do, and looked at what happened. And he said, well, it sounds like you've got a dissociative disorder. He said it could be argued you've got dissociative identity disorder. However, you've definitely got complex PTSD. How I'm going to diagnose you with borderline personality disorder with dissociative features. So that's how my diagnosis came about. So that's a really long answer to that question.
No, I suppose because it's a very powerful story, and thank you for sharing to us, an intricate detail of that powerful story. But I suppose what I want to hear from you is, how did your parents deal with this? Because obviously this is too much to handle for any parent. How did they help you out during that stage of your life?
You mean, well, this is me in my 50s, this breakdown in the prison. So my parents didn't know about it. They didn't know I was having a breakdown. When I was 7, I began to have behavioural problems. I set fire to my sister's bed. She wasn't in it. I was having screaming tantrums where I'd scream for ages, and my mother decided I had a split personality and took me to a psychiatrist who saw good little Sandie and just thought it was because we'd recently moved house. I was the only adopted child in a family that ended up having 4 biological children soon after adopting me. I was born in 1959. And back then, my parents couldn't have children. They adopted me, and then they had 4 in the next 3.5 years. So they wound up with 5 children under 4. But back then, if you were adopted, you were genetically suspect in a way. So when I started to have really severe behavioural problems, mental problems at 7, they wondered if it was something genetic that had triggered it. But I had, my family had been in a bit of chaos. My father was in the Air Force by then, but when I was 5 years old, I'd been sexually abused by an uncle. And it was when my father was in the throes of alcoholism. My mother had all these little children, and his way of getting me to stay silent, and I only remember this later, was to say they would give me away. They didn't need me, you know. My sister had been born by then. I'd get taken to a hospital and tied up, and these memories came later in a way. So my grandmother, unaware that was happening, took me up to her farm, and I was fine. But when I came back and we moved house, we'd moved this is in Australia, from Queensland to Adelaide. I took my sister into a backyard pool, and neither of us could swim, and we got in this pool, and I just got, back then the strap was used, and it changed the dynamic with my family. They thought I was dangerous. Mind you, we just were on a little pool bed and got out, and my father made this comment that he wished they'd never, he wished they'd never gotten me, and I was nothing but trouble. So I was around 7, and it triggered a lot of trauma. which I acted out at the time. So technically they didn't deal with it very well. They didn't know how to deal with it. They had 5 little kids. Dad had a drinking problem. So all they saw was that they had suddenly had a problem child on their hand.
And
yeah.
And of course, Sandie, this is really a crucial part of your life. You experiencing it at such a young age, and I understand that you've written a memoir to kind of capture all of your experience. And I understand that part of your story was written in the voice of a 7-year-old, because as just like what you've said, this is really a crucial element of your formative years. So, Sandie, how were you able to step into the point of view of a small child?
I was able to do it because after I was diagnosed with borderline personality, I was forced to resign from my job, of course, for mental health reasons. And straight after that, my daughter died of a drug overdose. So I was in a really bad state of grief. My father had died, I'd lost my job, and my daughter had died, all within 1 year. And writing has always kept me sane. It's when I've been in trauma, I've picked up a pen and scribbled. Mind you, that scribble usually went in the bin. But around that time, I was switching all the time. When I dissociate, it's like I fall back and the adult everyday world vanishes. And one of the states I was going into was that of a little child. I could hear a little child speaking in my head, and I just was feeling this connection. I'd always pushed this part of myself away because this part was needy. This part was a part that had come alive in the protection prison, begging a pedophile, and a dangerous pedophile who had been a police officer, begging a pedophile to save her, help, free me, save me, get me out of here. So I decided I needed to write about myself as a little child. And because I was hearing that voice, I was able to connect with the part. But I still had a lot of gaps in memories. So I took the memories that I could access, and I'd accessed other memories in that state, and I just, with an adult writing skill, let that part of me write and speak. And sometimes, other parts would come and want to tell their story. But in the end, though, it wasn't a dissociative part. It was, when I was 7, I was called Sandra, not Sandie. It was little Sandra actually being able to tell her story when at the time, I was silenced. We didn't, in our house, we never talked about anything. And I think it was because I was in so much grief. I'd lost my job. I was very isolated at the time. I didn't want to see anyone. I couldn't cope with normal social chitter-chatter. People don't handle death. So if you've just lost a daughter and a father, often, you can go out and people will want to talk about the fitness regime and that because it's uncomfortable. So I avoided that and became very insular. And I think for the first time in my life, I let the dissociation just be. Normally I would have been terrified, run away. But I decided that when I spoke up at work about the breakdown in the prison, it was a turning point. It was a point where I went, I have dissociated all my life. I've fled afterwards, and it's time I dealt with it. So this little child voice in me was reliving these events and feeling them. And that's how, and I also was a creative writing teacher. I actually had writing skills as well.
That is really a very powerful experience, because essentially what your memoir is all about is a story of recovery. And thank you for just, having the courage to share your story. So a lot of people, especially now that we're talking much more about mental health, a lot of people could learn from your story of recovery. But Sandie, Aside from your experience at such a young age, at 7-year-old, another turning point in your life is at 15, you had a mental breakdown while you were incarcerated in a juvenile institution in the 1970s. Obviously, going back in the 1970s, a lot of things are very different in relation to mental health and in relation to, how we manage people in institutions. But could you just share to us your lived experience in relation to being incarcerated?
Yes. When I was 14, I ran away from home. At 12, I'd been sexually abused by some boys. When I started high school, I was sexually abused. I wasn't raped. A boy did try to rape me. I was 12. And I managed to get away, but his friends started pinning me to bus stops and that. And my parents' way of dealing with things was always to send me to my grandmother, who was very supportive. I went to my grandmother's farm, and she lived in Victoria in Australia. And I began to get, I was okay there. I'd gotten away from what was happening, but my parents, being Air Force, my father got a transfer and moved. And I decided to go back to them. I think part of us are always drawn to go home. And when I went home, I was angry that they blamed me for what happened with these boys. And I began acting out. I began shoplifting, running away from home. And I guess to cut a long story short, I ran away and I was sentenced. I slept in an old farm shed. I was with a friend, a railway shed. And I found some old checks and took them to the bank to try and get them cashed. Of course, they were railway checks and worth nothing. And I was put in an institution for stealing at 14. I spent 10 months in there, went back home, and things were worse. I was self-harming. I didn't know anyone where they lived. I was trying to kill myself, taking overdoses and whatnot. So I got committed for being an uncontrollable child and put back in the institution. And it was clear I had mental health problems. I was given Mellaril and I was acting out and dissociating, but I had a lot of friends. And I found when I was young, as long as I had friends, I coped with things. But anyway, this is in New South Wales. They closed an institution that was called Parramatta Girls' Home, and it had been quite brutal. And in its place, they decided to put a unit for the most unmanageable girls in custody, girls with emotional, behavioural, mental health problems. I was the first girl transferred there. There were already 2 girls who'd remained after Parramatta Girls' Home had closed. So this was an experimental unit, and it was, wow, let's see what happens if we're nice to these kids. Let's see what happens if we, instead of drugging them on heavy psych drugs and locking them in isolation cells, well, they still did the second, but let's actually look at what happens if we teach life skills and we form bonds. It should have been a great experience. Like I said, I was 15 years old and I was serving a sentence for being an uncontrollable child. The 2 other girls there, one of them was a young street kid, young Aboriginal girl from Redfern in Sydney. The other was a girl who'd been charged with murder when she was 14. Her and a friend had murdered a 3-year-old boy in their sleep. They'd strangled him and beaten him with saucepans. It was pretty horrific. So she was in there too, and I was put in a dormitory with this girl. So there was just me and her in the dormitory, and we looked quite alike, except she was 17, I was 15. I thought she was a really blonde, beachy type of girl, a bit prettier than me, but she was very, very charismatic and had a lot of influences with a lot of girls. But, like, there was only the three of us there, and then a few more girls came. Well, we had freedom in this place. The officers didn't watch us all the time. And even though they had a heap of girls who'd tried escaping before from other places, I'd tried several times, they put a picnic table out in the yard with chairs around the pool. So we got the idea in our head that, wow, we can escape. And Christmas 1974, I didn't hear from my family. I'd been locked up the year before and parcels and that, no parcels came, nothing. And I just thought they'd totally wiped their hands of me. I didn't realise that no one knew the mail was going to the wrong address, and that's why it didn't come. So when some of the girls decided to escape, I decided to go as well. So it was the 27th of December 1974. The girl who had murdered the 3-year-old boy in his sleep, she wasn't coming. She decided she might be allowed to stay there when she's 18 if she behaved. So I scaled the wall with 3 other girls. What happened was about a minute, or could have been a few minutes after we left, she decided she would join us, and she scaled the wall after us. And ironically, we ran into her in a street. So suddenly at 15, I was on the run with these 4 girls, and the headlines in the paper were, child murderer escapes from institution, and we were part of a statewide police hunt. Anyway, I got picked up with another girl. We all got picked up except one, and the police let us go, believing her and I were twins. We dyed our hair black. But we're both blonde, but we dyed it black. And these country cops just said, oh, we picked up twins, and that was our story, and let us go. So we decided we'd all split up. And soon after, another girl and I got picked up by the police, and they didn't really care. We were being cheeky and that, but they didn't really care about us. They wanted to catch this girl who, was serving a sentence for the murder of this little boy. And, as kids in institutions now, I've got horrified that, back then, young girls had a different perspective of each other. So the police picked this other girl and me up. They took us into a police cell. I didn't know it was going to happen. They took us into separate cells. They handcuffed my arms. One police officer grabbed one arm, one grabbed the other. They put me against the wall, and they were smashing my head in, sort of going, where's Rhonda? Her name, where's Rhonda? Where's Rhonda? And they knocked me unconscious. They knocked me out cold. And I came to in another cell. The girl wasn't there, and one of the cops came in and put his boot in my face. Where is she? Where is she? And I wouldn't tell him, because somewhere in me I was just, I'm not, I had a vague idea where she was. I didn't know definitely, but it was a strange, I couldn't believe it had happened. My family, my mother had been to private schools. My father was in the Air Force. I wasn't actually a street kid. And I'd heard of young girls being raped in paddy wagons and beaten, but it was so far outside my reality. Anyway, we were taken back to Kambala, this girl and me, and after being in court, and I couldn't remember it, and I was really dizzy and disoriented. And we told the superintendent we'd been beaten up, but it was all around here, and he just said, you're probably resisting arrest. And I was different. I wasn't focused. I felt like I was dissociating, but I didn't know that word then, and I was in massive trauma. What happened was this young girl who'd murdered the toddler was picked up, and the girl I was caught with decided that I must have told the police. She hadn't. I wasn't a sort of a rough girl. I was sort of, I hadn't really experienced anything when I streetwise when I was locked up. I was bright at school. I'd, run away and been away for one night, literally. So all the girls turned against me, thinking that I told the police where this other girl was. So in this PTSD dissociative state, I started to lose days again. I could physically fight with my fists when I was attacked, but I couldn't handle undercurrents. And I kept coming to in isolation cells, and I'd have no idea how I got there, or in dormitories, or I was hearing voices in my head. Part of me, Sammy the witch part, was out writing poetry, and there was a part of me called Wildcat. And Wildcat was the fighter. Wildcat was the one who could defend me. And in the cells, I had a little tiny child part, Awa, who'd talk. And this was happening, and they just didn't know I was disturbed. Back then, I was diagnosed as having a character defect that didn't respond to psychiatric treatment, and they could see I was disturbed, and they could see I, was depressed. So I had this breakdown, and the girls knew I was having it, and I couldn't escape my body. I had no idea. It was the most horrific experience, because it was like being back in my family. I was locked in this prison with these girls who hated me, and I did escape 2 more times, but there was nowhere I could go to escape. I was losing time. I was suicidal. I was, scratching my body to bits. And one time I took petrol, and how I escaped again. That's how I dealt with it. But also in there, I learnt something that would stay with me my whole life while I had this breakdown. They had a swimming pool, and one of the officers said, "Look, train for the bronze medallion and swim." So I'd been a swimmer anyway, swimming 66 laps a morning, training when I wasn't. So I was swimming up and down this pool, and I could feel that it was helping me. And also I was studying somehow for a nurse's entrance, but also the sewing teacher gave me some cross stitch to do, and I'd never done it since. And I realised that even if I was disappearing, if I could do stuff, I could get tunnel vision, and I could focus on a task like swimming or study, or I could just do this cross stitch. And I thought, wow, this is getting me through. It was another form of dissociation. I didn't know that, but I think with that experience, I was able to study degrees later in life, no matter what crisis. And I realised that I had developed a tool to get through this. But anyway, I escaped 2 more times, and I was coming out of the dissociation. Third escape, I got raped. And the irony was the police beating had sent me spiraling into this dissociation. When I got raped and narrowly escaped getting gang raped, I was a 16-year-old girl in the inner city. No, I was running, screaming through the streets. I came out of the dissociation, and by then I wasn't this naive young girl who'd been locked up. And I just decided at that point I was never going to tell anyone what had happened. I thought I was responsible. I'd had a fling with a boy, walked into this house. I had no feminist consciousness at 16, but I came out of it, and it was like another me came out that was never going to tell anyone, that was going to survive, that was going to try and avoid going into that other state where I was either a little child or a witch. Sammy the witch wrote beautiful poetry and was quite psychic, and Awa just was needy. So this breakdown when I found myself as an adult in my 50s, I'm working with the corrupt cops in custody, helping them to write their story. I'm working with child sex offenders. The breakdown I had in the men's prison was in some ways identical to the breakdown I had as a 15-year-old girl while I was incarcerated. And that was partly what propelled me to face it and write my story. 2 occasions where I'm trapped in this situation and I can't escape it, and I'm aware of it. And I think it was a turning point. I looked back and thought, how could a young girl who is beaten unconscious by these police in a cell and has this mental breakdown and nothing's done, how could a young girl wind up being a teacher, teaching these guys to write their life stories in a prison? That wasn't what my book was about. My book wound up being about my childhood, mainly my time in the institution. And I guess it was a bit of a coming of age story because it looked at this naive young girl. You know, when I started high school, I was put in the top class, which was 1A, and I was swimming and running, and, I recovered from my breakdown at 7. And when I was sexually abused, I guess it brought back the early abuse, which was a silence in my life. But I was an incredibly naive young girl. My family, my mother was very middle class. My father's family were business people and owned their own homes. So I wasn't like a lot of the girls who'd state wards who'd had horrific times on the streets. So it's about a coming of age story, really as a young girl going into these institutions and discovering police violence and rape and coming out of it and going, just coming out of it a totally different, a self-reliant young girl, not a criminal though.
It's such really a horrific story, Sandie. But I understand that, like what you've mentioned, is not just a coming out of age story, because I suppose what the audience can hear from you sharing to us that's really that powerful story is that there's also another theme that keeps on occurring on your memoir, on your experience. And I suppose because you are institutionalized, you have that experience of not being, you don't feel that you belong. So how does that feeling of not belonging impact your subsequent relationships?
Not belonging, the feeling of not belonging is a massive trigger that I've realized has always altered the course of my life. Because I didn't feel like I belonged in the family that raised me, I just had a sense that I don't fit here, and we moved all the time. So that was a habit. I lived in 8 different places by the time I was 7. That was number 8. And my family Air Force moved around, and then I was, I moved around. So what I'd find is I could make friends. I could make friends or even be in a workplace. And maybe when I was very little, I did belong, because I have that sense that I can connect with people. As soon as the feeling of I don't belong here and they don't like me and I'm not part of it, I almost go into a depersonalized state where the Sandie who is liked stops existing. And it's like a mirror. People who I've been friends with or had a connection with, they suddenly seem like total strangers. I can't connect what they're saying. I think they can't see me. They know I'm not acting like I usually do. And I often move. Oh, well, my life has ended. These friendships are over. Where I live doesn't. And hopefully this place I'm in now, I'm here for life where I live, this unit. But I would move house. I would move house in the middle of trauma because I'd look around and the furniture wasn't real and I wasn't real and I didn't belong here and my life had ended. And if I didn't belong, I may as well just go and start again. And I would do that over and over and over, but there'd be no bridge back, because in between knowing people and this dissociative state I'd go into, it's a massive trigger for me. And starting again, I would lose all connection with them. I've tried as an adult, I've tried to be aware of that. Even before I understood dissociation, I was aware that I hurt people sometimes. If I've got a close friend, we've shared, lots of secrets and, had a good time together, and I suddenly go into this state where I don't feel like I exist, I don't belong, I'm not real. And I go, well, this person's a stranger. This person doesn't know the me I've become, and I move on. I can cause a lot of hurt. And I think it was having that pointed out to me a couple of times. Because when I go into an I don't belong state, I go into, well, because I don't matter, nothing, I can walk away and it won't hurt anyone, because who would like me anyway? And that isn't how I normally feel about myself. So I've really had to work on the fact when I start to go, I don't belong here, because I'm picking up someone's annoyed with me or something, I have to really do reality checks. DBT actually does help with that. And my therapist has done a lot of part work. And like I said, I've worked as a drug and alcohol counsellor, and I use art therapy. I've trained in transpersonal art therapy. So what I've learned to do is to go, okay, there's a part of me that doesn't belong. What does that part need? What does that part want? Does that part want a bit of space, rather than to go, oh no, that part's coming out again. So it's always feeling like the outsider. And it happened in the girls' homes after the police beating. These girls were my friends. And as soon as I began to act like that, I couldn't connect with them. I couldn't talk to them. I felt like I didn't know them. I literally, if I don't belong, I disappear from myself as well as my environment. So it's something I've worked on a lot in therapy, and, I'm aware of in others too, that I've worked with.
One thing that I want to ask you, Sandie, is that just listening to your stories, it's very traumatic. But you're the one who wrote you wrote your memoir, so it must have been like more traumatic for you. So how did you manage self-care while writing about your own experience of trauma?
How I managed self-care was I learned the basics. Luckily, I've never had alcohol, drug problems, except for, my 20s, a bit of experimental drug use, which was common at the time. So I've learned that no matter how traumatic something is, if I try and exercise, if I try and eat a balanced diet, if I try and have a bit of fun, go to the movies or things, I can cope. But mainly it was to let the emotions out. I actually felt like I was going into a place I denied all my life. When I was younger, I hated these dissociated parts. I hated that I had a needy child in me that would wind up in trauma bonds with, people who could be quite predatory. And that child actually was a child wanting to be saved and rescued by almost like a Stockholm syndrome. So that part can just blow my life to pieces. But when I wrote my memoir, I actually I had to go into that 7-year-old and honour her experiences. It's not graphic. My memoir has no graphic younger child sexual abuse, because to me it's fragments of memory. I don't have that. I only have tiny little memories, and there's no door in, there's no door out. I'm just there and I'm not. So throughout the whole time I wrote it, I was seeing my therapist, who I do trust. And at times he was going, do you need a break from this? And I was driven. No, I have to write it. It's something I have to do. I have to get through this. I have to face it. So at times it was very emotional. And then at other times I was just connected to the writing. Once the story was out, it felt quite cathartic. And then I had to look, well, now I have to look at how do I craft it? How do I write, is that a good sentence, a bad sentence? So I found I was going into writing about these experiences, and then I was stepping out to the writer, but I wrote in different voices. Like what I actually did, part of me wrote as an adult. I wrote as a 15-year-old girl. So most of this story, to actually write it, I had to be the 15-year-old. I had to be this young girl who felt like the outsider and didn't belong, and had no concept about why it would be Tuesday and then it would be Thursday and her legs would be scratched to bits. Or I had to go back to the little girl who had an imaginary friend who was a witch, and the witch was another part of her, and the little girl who believed, Sammy the witch was real and her friend and would help her and magic her out of situations. So to me, it was a really powerful reconnection with myself. And in a sense, it was a luxury. I'd worked as a counsellor and teacher. So when I lost my job, even though I was on unemployment benefits, I had some superannuation, enough to pay for therapy. So my children were older. My son with autism was 18 at the time and living with his father. So I lived alone, and I had this space where I could just be and let the emotions out and grieve for my daughter too. And what the writing did, I was in so much pain when she died, as all parents who lose a child to a drug overdose are. And I found the writing gave me a safe space to go. And as long as I'd step out of it and allow those feelings and look after myself, basically, I had a sense that if I got through writing this book, I would be validating basically the life I'd run away from. Because when I ran away from these other parts of me that came out whether I wanted them to or not, I was, really running away from my life and couldn't remember it.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And a lot of people would already have come across your story because you're actually on national press. In fact, I've come across your story through Daily Mail. So have you heard from people how they responded to you when you shared your story? And also, could you give us some suggestions for those who might have similar experience to you? How could they heal and understand trauma and mental illness through writing?
Okay. I'll sort of start, I guess, how people have responded. A lot of people have identified with it, especially people who've been through institutions as teenagers and have had ongoing trauma. Some people loved my story and said, wow, it was a great adventure story. Other people found it quite confronting. Because I decided when I wrote it, I was writing it for me at that point, totally for me. And in some of the scenes, I hold the person in. So I literally am diving into this institution and what it was like on a daily life. And then the dissociation, I was dissociated when I wrote a lot of it. So I'm writing as a dissociated person. So it wasn't your typical straight story. I mean, with voice of a little child and a teenager and teenage witch and a wildcat and teacher. But people, feedback has been really positive, and a lot of people said they just really, really identified with that trauma and dissociation. It has a more positive ending. A lot of people said to me, wow, you take us on a rocky road, you take us totally into that world, and we're with you through the mental breakdown and with you when we come out of it. What we might have liked was how you managed to, I had 1 year of high school. I was locked up, and that was my high school education. I finished the first year. And people said, well, we want to know how you completed a master's degree and became a teacher and became a counsellor and your marriages and that. And I had to say, well, that's a different story. This story starts with my breakdown, and the goal for me at that time was to understand what is dissociation, why do I do it, what is borderline personality, what does that mean to me as someone in my 50s diagnosed, when really it describes me a lot more when I was younger and had those behaviours. So it meant, but the feedback is, people just said it's a page turner. Gee, that sounds like bragging, but a page turner, it's a great read. And others said, like, it's quite confronting because you take us into that world, you hold us there. We would have liked you to skim over the bad bits and then, So basically that's how people respond. But people finish it. They said, oh, I finished it really fast. And others say, I read it, think about it a bit. So, sorry, could you say the next part of the question?
Yes. So the second part of the question is, what's your suggestion for others who want to heal and understand trauma and mental illness by writing about it?
Okay. I think writing is such a powerful way to do with it. Writing, photography and art, even getting your old photos out to write it. A lot of people are scared. They think if I open it all up, I will be totally overwhelmed by it. So there's often a fear of going in. There can be a gliding over the surface or needing to show every detail. So I often think with if you're going to write about trauma, it's sometimes quite important to have a safe space to do it and a safe space to exit it, like to give yourself time. And I know when I first started to write this story, I didn't write it to be a published book. Perhaps somewhere in my head I would have liked it to be a published book. I went through different phases. The first stage of the first draft, I just wrote it. And, if I was angry with someone, I came on the paper and I was venting and it said this, and I looked at this and thought, oh, this is one great big vent, and I wouldn't show it to anyone. The next time I censored myself, oh, I can't say that, I look really terrible. Oh, I better not say that. So I censored it. And the third time I just wrote it for me. I just went, just write it, go with the emotions, go with what comes up. Don't try and make it a brilliant bit of writing. The purpose of trauma writing is therapeutic. Like, it's your story, it's actually finding all these creative ways to do it. And art. If you can't write, scribble, take photos, just get some paint and splotch it round. And I can't draw. I may have studied transpersonal art therapy, but I'm not a drawer. I like photography. I scribble all over the place, and it's just about expressing it until that emotion comes up and you think, wow, this is the story, this is the emotion. But it is important to do it safely. If you can afford to talk to someone in therapy, or even connect with a writer's group to get the writer's element. You mightn't want to take your most personal story in, but sometimes it's good to learn a few writing techniques with it as well. So you're actually having a little space, but it's worth writing. I think everyone's story. I mean, our stories are the history of our time, and writing about trauma and writing about coming out of trauma. Often, trauma can be cathartic. I love Joseph Campbell and the hero's journey. I call it the heroic journey. Gender neutral, but I love that concept of life is normal, and to transform the normal world falls away, and all of your supports and things are slipping away, and you find yourself in the nadir, a really dark place, and you've got to find the inner treasure inside of you to get through it. You have to face your demons, and often while you're in there, I found that my dissociative parts kept me alive. Wildcat could fight off people. Sammy loved art and poetry and dreams and the psychic. And little Awa was part of me that could feel and was read and was affectionate. So you might find by writing it that who you were in that trauma is actually your strength.
Absolutely. Those are really good, helpful advice, especially for someone who could identify with what you've experienced. And thank you for giving us those tips on how we could actually capitalize on writing when it comes to managing our trauma. Now, we're nearly, sorry, I have to trim that down. Well, thank you for sharing to us your powerful story and how to navigate such traumatic experiences, Sandie. But finally, what else is in the pipeline? And if people wanted to reach out to you, what platforms can they get in touch with you at?
Well, I am on Instagram and Twitter. I'm developing a website at the moment, which I've tried to avoid social media a little bit because we're in lockdown and I find it all consuming. But I am on Instagram and Twitter. What I'm doing at the moment, I'm doing a little bit of work, a little bit of ghostwriting for others who've been through institutions, not memoir size, but short stories. Eventually, I would actually like to look at the transpersonal aspect of trauma more. So I love dream work and Jungian stuff, but I actually want to look at a little bit through a spiritual, not a religious element, but looking through it through spirituality and maybe shamanism and art and drumming and ways to feel trauma while actually transforming it and valuing it as, valuing the sorrow as much as the joy. So I'm still writing.
Exciting project, Sandie. Well, it's a pleasure having you here on the VRH show, but unfortunately, time is against us. But I look forward to hearing more about your work, and all the best to your memoir. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me. Thanks.